Should Christians be operating with an Old Testament perspective on world affairs or a New Testament perspective on world affairs? Is there a difference between an Old Testament and a New Testament perspective on world affairs? And I ask this question in an effort to reflect on where we are at today. Today being, what is this, March 24th, 2023, as I record this. But just the general context of the world: Russia, Ukraine, China, and Russia uniting, all the things that are taking place, rearranging the chess pieces in the Middle East, the U.S. virtual abandonment of any, what am I trying to say, any moral presence on the world stage, given how the U.S. has handled affairs over the last several decades, and some of the changes in that regard that I've commented on in some other videos. But my question today is, how in the world should a nation be operating today? And is there a difference between how that would be answered in the Old Testament versus the New Testament? And I would suggest that there is, for the following reasons. And I'm not including any particular verses at this time or any particular citations. I look forward to your comments, citing verses and citing pastors or writers or philosophers, whoever you want to cite, to help flesh out this discussion. But I would say that generally speaking, the Old Testament view of the nation state, particularly from the perspective of Israel, is that having been founded, Israel viewed herself as the nation of God, the people of God. The Jews were the children of God. And the expectation was that there would always be a king on the throne in Jerusalem, that Israel, as a defined territory, would be given to the descendants of Abraham through Isaac, and that would continue forever. And it would continue not just generally speaking, but even particularly speaking. The year of Jubilee, which was never celebrated, would have seen a return of all lands to the original inhabitants, the descendants of the original inhabitants of Israel. When the land was apportioned unto Joshua, and different tribes settled the lands, and different families had their lands allotted to them, that inheritance was to stay in that family forever, was the expectation. And there are issues about that we can talk about later. But the general sense, the overarching sense that I want to focus on is that forever there would be a king, a descendant of David on the throne, and God would rule over the nation through the king, through the temple structure, the high priest, and the religious framework that had been instituted under Moses. And that was how the world was to be understood. And in the charge to the Hebrew people, I said I wasn't going to use any verses, but in Exodus 19, I may even get the reference wrong as I say this, but Exodus 19, there's the initial challenge that God saying he had chosen them to be a priesthood to all the nations, that all earth was to be reached through the Jewish people, to bring all people back into relationship with God in the religious structure that had been established in Israel. Well, by the time we get to the New Testament, Israel, the Jewish people, had been a subject people for a long time, for several centuries, and they hadn't known any control except for a brief period under the Maccabees. Hadn't known any control and self-direction in Israel or on the world stage at all. And so when Jesus appears on the scene, as we often hear in the context of, well, at least in the context of the Baptist background I grew up in, as Jesus appears on the scene, represented as the fulfillment of all that Yahweh, that God had promised to Israel when it comes to the Messiah and to the Redeemer and the restoration of Israel as a people, it wasn't in the context or in the framework of a politically united and distinct body of Jews, of the nation of Israel, but it was as God's Son sent as the Redeemer, the sacrifice for sin, so that God the Father sent God the Son to die on the cross for sin, and that then becomes the means by which all people are going to realize relationship with God, that the promises made to Abraham are ultimately going to be fulfilled. The promise, the covenant with David ultimately is fulfilled with Christ at the center of now a non geographic kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom that's reflected in the context of all the peoples of all the earth. And then we get into the first few hundred years of Christian history, and by the end of the 5th century, um, Theodosius I makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so from that point forward, there's a tension that is, uh, I was going to say reinstituted, but is instituted in Christianity with respect to the relationship between church and state. And then by the time we get to the founding of the United States of America, where there is an undeniable, I would suggest, influence of Christian thought in the framing of the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, there is, in the words of Thomas Jefferson to the Dansbury Baptist Association, there is the intent uh, that there be a separation of church and state, a wall of separation that keeps these two um, aspects of human institutions and individual thought separate in a sense. And then it's that idea is kind of played out in the idea that in the old saying that two things you don't talk about in polite conversation are politics and religion, because it's difficult to separate one's political perspective and one's religious perspective, particularly if one is going to take seriously the idea that the religious beliefs one holds frames one's understanding, or the religious beliefs frame one's understanding of reality with a capital R, how the world is actually structured, how reality is actually structured, what is really going on in spite of how things appear. And so as Christians have wrestled with what that means over the centuries since Christ's birth, then there's, well, since Christ's birth, since Christ's death, resurrection, and the establishment of the Christian church, there's been a tension between how the church and the state ought to relate that isn't found in many other cultures, because for most cultures, for most periods in history, the state and the government were closely intertwined. And so there was no tension in theocracies today. In much of the uh, Middle East Muslim world, there is no tension between the church and state, because the church and the state are proverbial church, but in the Muslim context, there is no tension because the church and the state are unified in their goals and how they're going to achieve them. Not that there isn't dissension, not that there are more or less liberal elements in the different governments as things play out. Not that there haven't been some recent developments that suggest there may be more leeway there than we tend historically to give credence to in the Christian West. But the basic idea of the church defining the state uh, took Christianity several centuries of bloody war in Europe to reach a conclusion that no, we need to separate these two frames of organization, of operation, government and church, and we need to try to accomplish in the context of one what can't be or we haven't been able to accomplish in the context of the other. The United States formally makes that break, and yet there's still this tension between being, in the minds of many, America being a Christian nation. But the degree to which trying to frame America as a Christian nation by instantiating in law Christian ideals, Christian policies, I wonder if in fact we are both undermining the potential of the United States as a liberal democracy and undermining the witness of the Christian to what Christianity ultimately speaks to, namely the relationship of the individual to God through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, and how that message Christianity wants to hold applies no matter where in the world one lives, no matter what the political or social context in which one finds oneself. And if we insist on trying to instantiate that in law through government, that we undermine the very basis for that belief, that framework. In other words, if we try to instantiate an Old Testament view of nation states, where the church and the state are one, the religious entity and the political entity are one, then are we undermining the very international, universal, you might say, message of Christianity, that it doesn't matter what the government under which you are living or what the context in which you find yourself, you can have relationship with God. You can be expected to live as a believer by the power of the Spirit in relationship with God to the point of death or whatever else living in relationship with God might entail. For the first few centuries of Christianity, Christians had no say whatsoever in the body politic. Christians were martyred. Tertullian, I believe it was said in the second century, as I recall, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That is, as people were willing to die for their faith, their testimony to a belief that was worth dying for spurred others to look into Christianity and the claims of Christianity and realize for themselves the power of God in their lives, even if that power resulted in death. So I want to bring this to a close by just asking, where are we in the church in the 21st century? Over the last several decades, I've basically um, been kind of trusting leaders, political and religious, to uh, work together to realize the best possible framework for um, us as citizens in a free nation. I do think that America represents the greatest experiment in governance in history to date, um, overall, and yet I don't think it is supreme or that it is necessarily going to last forever. And I think we see plenty of science to suggest that we have, in fact, perhaps reached the end of the line as a nation, or at least as a meaningful nation on the world stage, if we don't get our house in order. And I don't just mean religiously, I mean politically as well. And that's what I want to come to, is how we as Christians view our place in the world as Americans, and then how we as Christians and Americans have utilized or taken advantage of our position as for the last couple of decades, or I guess 4 decades now, the lone superpower in the world. What have we done to facilitate an environment in the world in which Christianity, the beliefs of Christianity, are spread, the ideals of democracy are spread, um, as opposed to trying to enforce those simply by the power of being the United States of America. Um, to what degree is the current Ukraine Russia war a product of poor U.S. policy? To what degree is the um, collusion of Russia and China against America a product of poor U.S. policy? To what degree has poor U.S. policy been a reflection of an effort to meld Christian beliefs, particularly certain beliefs about prophecy in Revelation and other passages, in the context of Christian interpretation of Scripture in the 20th and 21st century? To what degree are we here because we have focused on the wrong thing and perhaps focused on a misunderstanding, or even if it's a correct understanding of prophecy in a way that we have tried to affect the outcome of events through legal, through legislative, through government means, as opposed to, as Christians, simply bearing witness to Christ before all men and letting God work in hearts. So, anyway, went on a little bit longer than I intended, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. I appreciate your time. Thank you all very much. Bye bye. Thank you for taking the time to visit. Appreciate your thoughts in response to this video. If you'd like to look at some more of what I've said about different topics, the first video that's referenced here, MMT, the proverbial money tree. I take a non-economics professor view of MMT and what it seems to suggest versus how finances work is, at least I understand it, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. And then also draft platform for the American Dream, Part 4, Social Security, one of a 9-part series in which I outline some proposed topics for the political parties to pick up and provide some substantive policy comments or proposals for the American people to choose from in the 2024 election. Thanks again for your time. Look forward to hearing from you on these or any of the other videos I've posted. Thank you much. Bye-bye.